They told you Israel is an oppressor. They told you it's about occupation and apartheid. They told you Israelis are colonizers with no legitimate claim to the land. But what if everything you've heard is a carefully constructed narrative designed to delegitimize the only democracy in the Middle East? What if the Israeli perspective reveals a story of an ancient people returning home, surviving multiple attempted genocides, and building a thriving nation while surrounded by enemies sworn to destroy them? This is how Israelis see their own history, their own fight for survival, their own miraculous rebirth. This is the Israeli narrative. And if you're ready to hear their side of the story, hit that subscribe button for the Islamic Files, because what you're about to learn will challenge everything you thought you knew. Let's dive in. From the Israeli perspective, their connection to this land goes back over 3,000 years, and it's not mythology or religious fantasy. It's documented historical fact verified by archaeology, ancient texts, and continuous presence. Ancient Jewish kingdoms existed here. The temple stood in Jerusalem for 1,000 years before being destroyed by Romans. The Hebrew language originated here. Jewish holy sites, religious texts, prayers, and identity have centered on this land for over 3,000 years. Around 70 CE, Romans brutally crushed Jewish revolts, destroyed the Second Temple, and expelled most Jews from their homeland in what historians call the Jewish diaspora. But even then, Jews never completely left. There was always Jewish presence in Jerusalem, Hebron, Tiberias, and Saft. Small communities maintained continuous Jewish presence for 2,000 years. Israelis emphasized that Jews didn't just move on and forget about this land. For 2,000 years in diaspora, Jews faced every Jewish holy day toward Jerusalem. They prayed next year in Jerusalem at every Passover. They mourned the destruction of the temple. Connection to this land was the core of Jewish identity maintained across 2 millennia of exile. This wasn't casual nostalgia, it was identity itself. From the Israeli view, Jews are the indigenous people of this land. They were here first, 3,000 years ago. They were expelled by imperial conquest, and they never stopped considering this their homeland. When Jews began returning in the late 1800s, from the Israeli perspective, this was indigenous return after colonial expulsion, not colonization. By the late 1800s, Jews in Europe faced escalating deadly persecution. Pogroms in Russia killed thousands of Jews, destroyed entire communities. The Dreyfus Affair in France showed that even fully assimilated Jews weren't safe from anti-Semitism. Violent hatred of Jews was spreading across Europe, intensifying rather than decreasing despite emancipation and modernization. Jews realized integration had failed. No matter how much they contributed to European society, how patriotic they were, how secular they became, they would always be scapegoats, always be the other, always be vulnerable. Out of this desperate situation, Theodor Herzl founded political Zionism in 1896 after witnessing the Dreyfus trial. The idea was existential. Jews need their own state where they finally control their own destiny, where they're never again at the mercy of host nations who can turn on them, where they can defend themselves. And where should this state be? The only land that was ever the Jewish homeland, the land of their ancestors, the land they'd prayed about for 2,000 years. From the Israeli perspective, this wasn't colonialism, this was return. Then came the Holocaust. From the Israeli perspective, this is the event that proved the Zionist case absolutely and undeniably. 6 million Jews, 1/3 of world Jewry, were systematically murdered by Nazi Germany with collaboration from multiple European countries. Entire Jewish communities that had existed for centuries were obliterated. Jewish children, women, elderly, everyone marked for death simply for being Jewish. The world watched this genocide unfold and did essentially nothing. Britain actually restricted Jewish immigration to Palestine during the Holocaust, trapping Jews in Europe to die in order to appease Arab opposition. Ships full of Jewish refugees fleeing the Holocaust were turned away from Palestine and sent back to Europe, where passengers were murdered in death camps. From the Israeli view, this proved beyond any doubt that Jews desperately needed their own state. When Jews had no state, they were slaughtered by the millions while the world stood by. Only Jewish sovereignty could guarantee Jewish survival. Never again would Jews be defenseless. Starting in the 1880s, small groups of Jews began immigrating to Palestine. From the Israeli perspective, they didn't come to conquer or displace anyone. They came to escape persecution and rebuild Jewish national life in their ancestral homeland. They purchased land legally at market prices from willing sellers. Nobody was forced to sell. Ottoman records document these legal land purchases. Early Jewish pioneers bought land that was often considered worthless, swamps breeding malaria, deserts, rocky hillsides that nobody was using productively. They drained swamps where malaria killed settlers by the hundreds. They planted forests on barren hillsides. They built new cities like Tel Aviv in 1909 from literal sand dunes. They revived Hebrew as a living spoken language after it had been only a liturgical language for 2,000 years. From the Israeli view, they were building alongside existing communities, not displacing them. They bought land, worked it themselves with Jewish labor, and created new settlements on previously unused or underdeveloped land. After World War II, the United Nations proposed partitioning Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. From the Israeli perspective, Jews accepted this compromise even though the proposed state was tiny, had indefensible borders, and didn't include Jerusalem or most of the biblical Jewish heartland. The proposed Jewish state was about 5,500 square miles, roughly the size of Connecticut. Much of it was the Negev desert. The borders were impossible to defend, with the country only 9 miles wide at its narrowest point. Jews accepted it anyway because they desperately needed refuge for Holocaust survivors and for Jewish refugees being expelled from Arab countries. The Jews accepted partition despite it being far less than they hoped for, because they understood compromise was necessary and having any state was better than remaining stateless and vulnerable. But Arabs rejected partition completely. From the Israeli perspective, they didn't just reject it politically. Arab leaders explicitly vowed to drive the Jews into the sea, to eliminate Jewish presence entirely. The day after Israel declared independence on May 14, 1948, 5 Arab armies invaded simultaneously. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq all attacked with the stated goal of destroying the newborn Jewish state. From the Israeli perspective, this was attempted genocide. The Arabs weren't fighting to create a Palestinian state. If they wanted a Palestinian state, they could have accepted the UN partition plan, which gave them one. They were fighting to eliminate Jewish presence completely. Arab radio broadcasts called for Jewish blood. Leaders promised to finish what Hitler started. Israel was outnumbered, outgunned, a state declared just hours earlier with no formal army, facing professional Arab armies equipped with tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The entire Jewish population in Palestine was only 650,000, facing Arab armies from countries with tens of millions. Nobody expected Israel to survive. The US State Department predicted Israel would be destroyed within weeks. But somehow, through desperate fighting, incredible determination, superior tactics, and what Israelis consider miraculous intervention, Israel won its war of independence. But the victory came at terrible, devastating cost. 6,000 Israelis were killed, which was 1% of the entire Jewish population. Imagine losing 1 out of every 100 people in your country in 1 year. Every Israeli family lost someone. For Israelis, 1948 wasn't just independence, it was survival against attempted annihilation, a modern miracle against impossible odds. Yes, Palestinians became refugees during this war. From the Israeli view, the refugee problem was created by Arab leaders who started a war of extermination and lost. Israeli historians have documented that many Palestinians were told by Arab leaders to evacuate temporarily so Arab armies could destroy the Jews, after which they'd return to reclaim not just their homes, but Jewish property too. Some Palestinians left because of the chaos and fear inherent in warfare, which happens in every war throughout history. Some were expelled from strategic locations during active combat. But Israelis emphasize this happened in the context of Arabs launching a war of extermination against Jews. You can't start a genocidal war, lose that war, and then claim primary victim status for the consequences. Palestinians who chose to stay in Israel became citizens with full rights. About 150,000 Arabs remained in Israel and became Israeli citizens with voting rights, property rights, and representation in parliament. Those who fled became refugees because Arab countries started a war of annihilation and lost it. From the Israeli perspective, Arab countries could have easily settled Palestinian refugees in their vast territories, but Arab countries, with territory 650 times larger than Israel, deliberately kept Palestinians in refugee camps for 75 years to use as political weapons against Israel. The Arab League explicitly passed resolutions instructing member states not to integrate Palestinian refugees, to keep them separate and preserve their refugee status. From the Israeli perspective, this reveals that Arab countries never actually cared about Palestinians as people. They cared about destroying Israel and cynically used Palestinian suffering as a tool for that goal. Meanwhile, something the world rarely discusses happened simultaneously. Over 850,000 Jews were expelled from Arab countries between 1948 and the 1970s. Jewish communities that had existed in Iraq, Egypt, Syria, Yemen, Libya, Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria for over 2,000 years were ethnically cleansed through violence, legal persecution, and expulsion. These Jews fled to Israel as refugees, having been stripped of property, citizenship, and possessions. Israel absorbed these 850,000 Jewish refugees and integrated them fully within one generation. They became citizens, received housing, learned Hebrew, built new lives. They didn't remain in refugee camps for 75 years. They integrated and became productive members of Israeli society. From the Israeli view, here's the fundamental question nobody asks. Why is there no international demand for Jewish refugees' right of return to Arab countries? Why are Palestinian refugees the only refugees in world history where status passes to descendants indefinitely? Why are there now 5 million Palestinian refugees when only 700,000 originally fled? Israel knows the answer. Arab countries weaponized Palestinian suffering rather than solving it, while systematically erasing their own crimes against Jewish populations. In 1967, Arab armies massed on Israel's borders again, preparing for another attempt to destroy the Jewish state. Egypt's President Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran, which Israel had publicly declared would be considered an act of war. Nasser expelled UN peacekeepers from Sinai and moved 100,000 Egyptian troops with 1,000 tanks to Israel's border. He publicly vowed to destroy Israel, broadcasting radio speeches calling for Jewish blood and promising to drive Jews into the sea. Syria and Jordan joined military pacts with Egypt, forming a noose around Israel. From the Israeli perspective, this was attempted annihilation again, the second genocidal war in 19 years. Israel faced potential destruction from 3 fronts simultaneously. So Israel launched a preemptive strike on June 5, 1967, and won decisively in just 6 days, in one of the most stunning military victories in history. Israel destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the ground in the first hours. They captured the entire Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. They took the strategically critical Golan Heights from Syria, from which Syrian artillery had been shelling Israeli farms and kibbutzim for years. They captured the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, reunifying Jerusalem for the first time since 1948 and regaining access to Judaism's holiest sites, including the Western Wall. Israeli soldiers wept at the Western Wall, touching stones their people had been separated from for 19 years. From Israel's perspective, these territories were captured in a defensive war after being attacked, after facing genocidal threats, after having no choice but to strike first or face destruction. Israel immediately offered to return captured territories in exchange for peace and recognition. The Arab response came at the Khartoum conference with the famous 3 no's: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. When Egypt's President Sadat finally made peace in 1979, Israel returned every single inch of Sinai, including valuable oil fields and thriving settlements that were destroyed. This proved, Israelis say, that Israel will trade land for genuine peace with real partners willing to recognize Israel's right to exist. But there was no Palestinian partner willing to accept Israel's existence. From the Israeli perspective, the PLO was founded in 1964, 3 years before Israel captured the West Bank and Gaza. Think about that timing. The PLO was created when Egypt controlled Gaza and Jordan controlled the West Bank, yet the organization was already devoted to destroying Israel through armed struggle. This proves, Israelis say, that Palestinian opposition has nothing to do with occupation or settlements or 1967 borders. It's about refusing to accept any Jewish state in any borders. For decades, the PLO and its factions carried out horrific terrorist attacks deliberately targeting Israeli civilians. The 1972 Munich Olympics massacre, where Palestinian terrorists murdered 11 Israeli athletes and coaches on live television. The Ma'alot massacre in 1974, where terrorists took 115 people hostage in a school and killed 25, mostly children. The Coastal Road massacre in 1978, where terrorists hijacked a bus full of families and killed 38 civilians, including 13 children. Bombings, shootings, assassinations, targeting civilians in restaurants, markets, buses, schools. From the Israeli perspective, this was pure terrorism designed to spread fear and make normal life impossible for Israelis. This led to the Oslo Accords in 1993, where Israel took enormous, unprecedented risks for peace that divided Israeli society. Israel recognized the PLO, a terrorist organization responsible for murdering hundreds of Israeli civilians. Israel brought Yasser Arafat back from exile and gave him legitimacy. Israel gave Palestinians autonomy in major cities and provided weapons for Palestinian security forces. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin shook Arafat's hand on the White House lawn, despite Arafat's past as architect of terrorism. The hope was that Palestinians would use this opportunity to build institutions, establish peaceful governance, stop terrorism, and move toward peaceful statehood alongside Israel. But from Israel's perspective, Palestinians systematically violated the Oslo Accords and never held up their end of the bargain. Palestinian textbooks continued teaching that all of Israel from the river to the sea is occupied Palestine that must be liberated. Palestinian television broadcast virulently anti-Semitic content, glorified terrorists as martyrs and heroes, and taught children that killing Jews is the highest calling. Streets, schools, and town squares were named after terrorists who murdered Israeli civilians. And most critically, terrorism didn't decrease during Oslo. It exploded catastrophically. Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad launched wave after wave of devastating suicide bombings targeting Israeli civilians. Cafes exploded during lunch. The Dolphinarium nightclub bombing killed 21 teenagers waiting in line outside on a Friday night. Over 1,000 Israelis were murdered by terrorism during the Oslo peace process, mostly civilians, hundreds of children. From the Israeli perspective, imagine living in a country smaller than New Jersey where buses explode regularly, killing dozens. Where sending your child to school on a bus means genuinely not knowing if they'll come home alive. Where going to a cafe for coffee might mean dying in a fireball. That was daily life for Israelis during the 1990s and early 2000s. Every Israeli knows someone who was killed or seriously injured in terrorism. When you offer peace and territorial compromise and receive suicide bombings murdering your children in return, you learn a bitter lesson that Israelis carry. Your enemy doesn't want peace or a state alongside you. They want you dead. The Second Intifada, starting in September 2000, confirmed Israeli worst fears about Palestinian intentions and destroyed the Israeli peace camp. After Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak offered Palestinians a state on over 90% of the West Bank, plus all of Gaza, with East Jerusalem as capital, Arafat said no, without even making a counteroffer. Then he returned to the Palestinian territories and launched the deadliest, most violent intifada. From Israel's view, this proved conclusively that Palestinians aren't interested in peace or statehood alongside Israel. Over 1,000 Israelis were murdered in just a few years. Suicide bombers struck almost weekly at the intifada's height. The Park Hotel Passover massacre in 2002 killed 30 people during a Seder, the holiest Jewish family meal celebrating freedom from slavery. A Palestinian suicide bomber walked into a hotel dining room full of mostly elderly Holocaust survivors and their families and detonated, murdering 30 and wounding 140. The timing was calculated for maximum Jewish pain. Israel responded with Operation Defensive Shield, and eventually built a security barrier. That barrier, universally condemned internationally as the apartheid wall, actually worked exactly as intended. Suicide bombings dropped over 90% after the barrier was completed. Israeli lives were saved. Children could ride buses again without terror. From Israel's perspective, the barrier proved that Palestinian terrorism could be dramatically reduced with proper security measures, even if the entire world condemned those measures. When facing suicide bombers murdering your children, you build a barrier to stop them. That's basic self-defense that any country would implement. Israel's withdrawal from Gaza in 2005 was one of the most wrenching, controversial decisions in Israeli history. Prime Minister Ariel Sharon made the decision to evacuate every settlement from Gaza and withdraw all Israeli forces. Over 8,000 settlers who had lived in Gaza for decades were forcibly removed. Israel left Gaza completely. Not a single Israeli soldier or settler remained. From the Israeli perspective, if Palestinians wanted to prove they could govern responsibly, here was their chance. Gaza could become the Palestinian Singapore, a thriving coastal territory with Mediterranean beaches, a port, international aid pouring in, and a motivated population. This was the test of Palestinian intentions. Instead, from the Israeli perspective, Palestinians chose terrorism and war over peace and development. Hamas won Palestinian legislative elections in 2006 and violently took full control of Gaza in 2007. Immediately after taking power, Hamas began firing rockets at Israeli towns. Not occasionally, thousands of rockets over the following years. Sderot became the most bombed town on earth. Residents there lived with 15 seconds warning between alarm and rocket impact. That's how long they had to reach bomb shelters. 15 seconds. Israeli children in communities near Gaza grew up with severe PTSD. From Israel's perspective, Gaza withdrawal proved devastatingly that ending occupation doesn't bring peace when the other side is committed to your destruction. It brings rockets, terror tunnels, and more violence. Gaza could have become prosperous. Instead, Hamas spent billions building terror tunnels and rocket arsenals rather than hospitals, schools, and infrastructure. From the Israeli view, this revealed Palestinian priorities. Destroying Israel matters more than building Palestine. Israel imposed a blockade on Gaza from the Israeli perspective, not to punish civilians, but to prevent weapons smuggling to Hamas, which was firing thousands of rockets at Israeli civilians. Israel still allows food, medicine, humanitarian goods, and construction materials into Gaza through regular convoys. Israel points out that Egypt also maintains a blockade on Gaza and also won't open its border freely. Why? Because Egypt also views Hamas as a dangerous terrorist organization. When Hamas fires rockets from civilian areas, deliberately using schools, mosques, hospitals, and residential buildings as launch sites, Israel targets this military infrastructure while trying desperately to minimize civilian casualties. Israelis emphasize repeatedly that no other army in world history has done more to protect enemy civilians during warfare. Israel warns civilians before strikes with phone calls, text messages, leaflets dropped from aircraft, and even roof knocking. Israel aborts strikes if civilians don't evacuate. Meanwhile, Hamas tells Palestinians to ignore Israeli warnings and stay in targeted buildings to become martyrs for propaganda purposes. From Israel's perspective, every Palestinian civilian death is genuinely tragic, and Israel works harder than any military to prevent them, but ultimate responsibility lies with Hamas for deliberately using civilians as human shields. Multiple wars have been fought in Gaza since Hamas took control, and most catastrophically the war in 2023. The international response follows a predictable pattern that infuriates Israelis. When Hamas fires thousands of rockets at Israeli civilians, the world is mostly silent. When Israel defends itself and Palestinian civilians die because Hamas uses them as shields, the UN Security Council holds emergency meetings, and Israel is condemned globally. From Israel's view, this reveals an anti-Semitic double standard where the Jewish state is uniquely denied the right of self-defense that every other nation takes for granted. On October 7, 2023, Hamas launched the most barbaric, savage terrorist attack in Israeli history. Over 1,200 Israelis were massacred in one single day. Families were burned alive in their homes. Parents were murdered in front of children. Children were murdered in front of parents. Women and girls were brutally raped, mutilated, and murdered. Babies were found decapitated. Entire families were wiped out. Terrorists live-streamed their atrocities on social media. Over 240 people were kidnapped to Gaza, including babies, children, and elderly Holocaust survivors. This wasn't military action or resistance. This was sadistic, evil barbarism deliberately designed for maximum cruelty and terror. The world expected Israel to just absorb this, the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. Israel responded with military force aimed at destroying Hamas's military infrastructure and rescuing hostages. Palestinian casualties mounted because Hamas uses civilians as shields, operates from schools and hospitals, and stores weapons in residential buildings. But Israel didn't start this war. Hamas did with the most brutal terrorist attack imaginable. If you massacre 1,200 people in the most sadistic ways possible, rape women to death, burn babies, and kidnap hundreds more, you bear full responsibility for the consequences. No country on earth would respond differently. Yet Israel is immediately pressured for ceasefires before it can destroy the terrorist organization that just committed genocide against it. The international response to October 7th revealed the anti-Semitic double standard with crystal clarity. Within days, protests erupted globally, not against Hamas for committing atrocities, but against Israel for planning to respond. Universities saw celebrations of Hamas terrorism, with students literally celebrating dead Jews. The message to Israel was unmistakable. Even when you suffer catastrophic massacre, you don't have the right to defend yourselves. Because you're Jews. From Israel's perspective, this proves that much international criticism of Israel isn't about legitimate concern for Palestinian rights. It's about denying Jews the right of self-defense and national sovereignty that every other people takes for granted. That's anti-Semitism. Yet despite everything, despite constant threats, despite international isolation, despite enemies on every border, despite terrorism, Israel has built one of the most successful countries in the world. Israel leads globally in technology innovation, medical research, agricultural technology, and cybersecurity. Israeli startups are bought by global companies for billions. Israeli medical researchers develop treatments used worldwide. Israel is one of very few countries in the Middle East with genuine democracy, free press, independent judiciary, and protection for minorities, including LGBT rights. Israeli society remains fundamentally vibrant, creative, and hopeful. Israelis get married and have children despite terrorism. They build businesses despite boycotts. They create art despite conflict. They live full, meaningful lives despite being surrounded by those who wish them dead. This resilience, this stubborn determination to thrive rather than merely survive, is core to modern Israeli identity. Jews spent 2,000 years as powerless minorities, persecuted, expelled, massacred in pogroms, culminating in the Holocaust. Never again. Now Jews have sovereignty, have a state, can defend themselves. Israel exists and will continue to exist because Jews learned the hardest way possible that they cannot rely on others for protection. Jewish survival depends on Jewish power and Jewish sovereignty in the Jewish homeland. Israelis believe history and morality vindicate them. Jews had no state, and 6 million were systematically murdered while the world watched. Now Jews have a state and can defend themselves. The question isn't whether Israel should exist. It does exist, and that's not changing. The question is when Palestinians and the broader Arab and Muslim world will accept this permanent reality and choose peace and coexistence over perpetual conflict. Israelis are willing to compromise, willing to share the land, willing to live alongside a Palestinian state if it's genuinely peaceful, but not at the cost of Israel's security or existence, not by returning to indefensible 1967 borders, not by accepting millions of Palestinian refugees whose return would end Israel's Jewish character, not by dividing Jerusalem, the eternal Jewish capital. Any peace must recognize Israel as the Jewish state, must end all Palestinian claims against Israel, must ensure Israel can defend itself, and must include genuine Palestinian acceptance of Israel's permanent legitimacy and right to exist. Until Palestinians accept these basic requirements, until Palestinian leaders stop inciting terrorism, until Palestinian education stops teaching children to hate and kill Jews, until Palestinian society genuinely accepts coexistence rather than elimination of Israel, the conflict will continue. But Israel will endure through everything because that's what Jews do throughout history. They survive against impossible odds. They build despite adversity. They thrive when others try to destroy them. Despite 2,000 years of persecution, despite the Holocaust, despite multiple wars aimed at annihilation, despite constant terrorism, Israel has built a thriving, successful nation that contributes enormously to human welfare globally. Am Yisrael Chai. The people of Israel live, and they will continue to live in their ancestral homeland, defending themselves, building their society, and waiting for the day when their neighbors choose peace over war, coexistence over elimination, life over death. So that's the Israeli narrative, but here's what'll blow your mind. Palestinians tell a story using the same facts that reaches the exact opposite conclusion.
Everything you just heard? Palestinians have receipts that tell a different story.
If you agreed with this video, you owe it to yourself to watch the Palestinian counter-argument. And if you disagreed with everything I said, you're gonna love the Palestinian video. Click it now. I dare you to watch both and make up your own mind.